in the first or second year, I can't quite remember, of my ordained ministry. This would have been back in the 1990s. I was the assistant rector at St. James's Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia, and I was invited to go and preach in my hometown where I grew up at St. John's Episcopal Church in Tappahannock, Virginia, about an hour away. The Reverend Bill Krulak was the rector then, dear friend of our families, invited me to come and preach. It was a summer Sunday, I remember, and I remember how nervous I was to go and preach there. I've been guest preacher any number of times down through the years, and it's much less nerve-wracking to preach before 300, 400, 500 strangers than it is about 100 people in your little town who knew you growing up. The Episcopal Church there in my hometown was literally across the street from the law offices where my father used to work. And in fact, he built that building before he became a judge later on. A place where when I was a teenager, I would sneak in when it was under construction to smoke cigarettes. And I'm sure that that was not invisible to townspeople, the kind of things that we were getting up to. So there I am as a young adult, dressed like this, in front of townspeople who had seen me long before anybody, much less myself, thought I would be dressed like this, in church listening to me preach. And what I remember immediately upon stepping into the pulpit was looking out and seeing a lot of wry grins, like, all right, we'll see how this goes. They were gracious. And it was a very mediocre sermon. I do know that. So I was thinking about that in light of Jesus preaching in his hometown of Nazareth today. And his experience was not at all like mine because he was Jesus. He's back in Nazareth. We're in the 4th chapter of Luke's gospel. And Jesus, we're told, is a faithful Jew. Every single Sabbath, wherever he is, he finds himself going to the synagogue to worship. And I think to get a sense of the story, it's really important to know a little bit of the context for synagogue life. At the time of Jesus, among Jews, this was really the cultural center of their corporate identity. It was a place of identity formation. And synagogues really developed some centuries before the time of Jesus, but they were flourishing when he came into history. I don't want to get too detailed here, and this is a little bit of a simplistic explanation, but after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the 6th century BC, the temple no longer exists for a good while, and moreover, Jews are dispersed. And many are taken into captivity, and over the ensuing centuries, there's this kind of diaspora movement of the Jews moving out of the Holy Land all around the Near East and the Roman Mediterranean basin there. And so it was impossible for most Jews to regularly get to Jerusalem for obvious reasons, just because of distance. And so they developed these smaller religious households, if you will, communities called synagogues. Synagogues, a temple in Jerusalem. If you think about it, the primary symbols were the altar and the priest because it was a place of sacrifice. Synagogue, much smaller, much more localized, would have been centered around the word, scriptures, and lay elders, including Pharisees and scribes who would interpret scripture. And so Jesus here in the synagogue in Nazareth, his hometown. The liturgy would have been probably not even as formal as ours is here today. It would begin with liturgical prayers and psalms, a reading of the Hebrew scriptures. Somebody would sit rather than stand in a pulpit to offer commentary, a sermon. And then there might be a collection for almsgiving, announcements about what's going on in the community, some teaching afterward maybe for youth. That's how it went. So you can think of synagogue life as they were kind of like low church Protestants, more than sort of Anglo-Catholic high church that would go on in the temple. Just think of it that way. Jesus in Nazareth, here he is before all those people who had seen him grow up. And we're told in the introduction to this story in Luke that notoriety has developed. The word is getting around that this Jesus, the one we saw as a little boy running around and scraping his knee and causing havoc in the streets sometimes, this is the one, the son of Mary and Joseph, and he's now here back. We're told that as the guest preacher, everybody, we have a guest. You will remember Jesus, son of Mary and Joseph, is here. They give him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. That's a big book, long book. It would have been a big scroll. And the sense of the story is that there's a real heightened energy in the synagogue room as Jesus unrolls that scroll. And I can imagine him kind of unrolling it and looking for the passage that he wants. And here it is. And we're told that he reads these words from the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he rolls it up, hands it to the attendant, sits down, looks out, and I'm imagining a pregnant pause as he looks at everybody in the room. And he says, today, in your hearing, this prophecy has been fulfilled. And I imagine there's another pregnant pause, and everybody's thinking, what does that mean? We'll come back next week, and he'll expound on this a little bit, and they don't like it much, but we're not there yet. So I have two questions for us today. Of all the places that Jesus could have gone in the book of the prophet Isaiah for this sermon, why did he choose Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 through 2? Of course, that is for Jesus to answer. But here's what I think. This part of Isaiah, did you hear me say chapter 61? We are way, way, way toward the very end of this long book that covers a lot of years in the history of Israel. We are now at the end, and the prophecy is about the long yearned for, long hoped for restoration and liberation and renewal and rebuilding of the people of Israel after the Babylonian captivity. They're coming back to Jerusalem. They're going to rebuild everything their forebears have taught them to hope for and pray for is going to come true, we're told. But this prophecy is about more than that. It's looking even beyond that out to some final freedom and liberation that is to come. And it will not come about, the prophet would have us know, by encouraging the Israelites to roll up their sleeves and work harder and do better. Don't make the same mistakes your forebears made that got you into this mess. Nor is it going to come about through a political change in leadership. It will come about because God, Yahweh, will send one into history and set all wrongs to rights and grant us the ultimate freedom and liberation that every human everywhere yearns for. And there are three things that we are told about this one that Isaiah prophesies. Number one, he has the Spirit of God. He has the power of God dwells in him. Number two, he is anointed. This is a reference to kingship. But in Isaiah, this kingship is a suffering king, a suffering servant. He is the Messiah, the Spirit-filled Messiah. And the third thing we're told is that he is sent. This is not something that God is going to wave a wand from heaven. He is sent into history, and he is sent into the world, and he is sent to all the world. Jesus, of course, is the one about whom Isaiah prophesies. And Jesus himself knows that about himself. He will be the Spirit-led, suffering, servant, anointed Messiah who is sent. And so the first thing to know about Jesus is the first thing that he tells us about himself. Because did you know what? In Luke's gospel, this is the very first time we hear from Jesus. This is programmatic. We already know that he's already had some ministry happening, but this is the first thing that Luke wants us to record. Jesus is the one who liberates us who are poor, who are captive, who are blind, who are oppressed. And we are to hear that both literally in the material, physical sense, but also spiritually, both and. So I hear this today and I think about where in my life am I impoverished? Where in my life am I still captive to sin, past regrets, any places of lack of forgiveness? Where am I blinded to seeing myself as I really am, as God sees me? Fallen, broken, sinful, but loved beyond imagining. Where am I oppressed? Where are anything in life that gets between that love of God and me? Things that want to separate me from the love of God. So I hope that you hear this today in exactly the same way. Where do you find yourself poor and impoverished, or captive, or blind, or oppressed? Believe the words of Isaiah. Believe the words that Jesus says about himself. He has come, and he continues to come. My second question is this: why Nazareth? Again, this is unique to Luke's gospel, that the first recorded words of Jesus happen in Nazareth. This is not chronological. Again, it's programmatic. It's thematically important. The first public act of Jesus happens in Nazareth because it's home. Precisely because it's his home. It is announced among the people and in the place that is closest to Jesus and those who are closest to Jesus. The place where the gospel begins to be fulfilled, where it is most clearly seen and heard, is wherever we are closest to God, to those around us, to our own selves. And I think it's important. Why? Why is it important to point that out? What might be helpful to us today in thinking about the fact that for Luke, Jesus shares the first things about himself in his hometown? Well, this is where I want you to imagine that I have a mirror here. I'm preaching to myself. You can listen. This past, I think it was Wednesday night, we had like the second of 2 freezing weather days. It was kind of like an extended bonus Christmas vacation. It was nice. Tuesday and Wednesday, just being home. And it was in the evening, and I was sitting in the chair that I usually sit in our family room in our den, and Susie was sitting where she usually sits, right next to me, but on the couch. And I was doing what a lot of us have been doing. I was scrolling on my phone through my X account, where I get a lot of news and commentary. And I don't know how long I'd been doing that, but for maybe 20 minutes or so, and I know that there were some groans here and there. I care very much about wildfires and wars and politics and diverse thoughts that I was reading about these kinds of events. And I finally spoke for the first time in probably 20 minutes to Susie. I just spoke up and I said, wow, boy, the temperature in my Twitter feed is hot. And she said, Susie said something very wise. She said, don't you have enough stress in your life worrying about yourself and the church? Why don't you just put social media away for a week or so? I thought that was a word of the Lord. Thursday night, we had our women's retreat speaker, Tish Warren, in the chapel speaking to a group. And the Q&A, somebody raised their hand and asked a question, kind of like what I'm, when this young woman expressed being, anxious about things going on in the world. And as a person of prayer, as a Christian, how do we work through that? And I thought Tish gave a great answer. She said, we're living in an age where we can know everything about anything all over the world at any moment. And we really weren't created for that. And I'm quoting Tish. She says, we were never meant to metabolize all the news from all over all the time. I think that's true. And again, remember, I'm speaking in a mirror. it is perhaps far easier to get animated about things happening out there, and I do care, and you do too, because I hear from you as well, than it is to be animated about the cares and concerns and occupations of my personal life right where I am in my own little Nazareth, in my home, and among you, and in the city of Houston. And I wonder if when we do that, when I do that at least, it's a way of kind of keeping God at a distance. Wasn't it Jesus who, in his parable of the sower, reminds us that the seed that is sown on the ground where the thorns grow up represents the cares of the world? The person who is overwhelmed with the cares of the world, and it will choke out the life. And I have to be very cognizant of that. I'm also thinking of that satirical character in Charles Dickens' novel, Bleak House, Mrs. Jellyby. You may remember that from your English class in high school. And she's this character who sets up this philanthropy to help a needy family or children in Africa, a mythical country in Africa, and she's consumed with this philanthropy to the neglect of her own children. Jesus picks Isaiah 61, and Isaiah 61 tells us, as we continue reading, that the concern of this Spirit-filled, anointed Messiah who will suffer and ascend into the world is for the whole world. It's not just for the Jews, but it is announced first and foremost among the Jews, and it happens in our own little Nazareth. The last thing Jesus says to his disciples before he ascends into heaven is, "Go forth into all the world." There's no square inch of this planet that is beyond my ultimate concern. But if you are going to affect all that, it begins right here in Jerusalem, or in today's gospel, right in Nazareth. And as you know, I love to study the early church and read historians a lot smarter than I am about how did it happen that this small religious sect who had no resources, no social or political capital, came to be the dominant religion of the empire in 3.5 centuries. And everything I read by the wisest scholars says the same thing. They cared very much about Rome and injustice. And they knew they were called to care not only for the Jews, but for all the Gentiles everywhere. But they were less concerned with the levers of power than they were concerned with leading lives of virtue, of character, and of modesty before a watching world. And that is precisely how they changed the world, by understanding that the gospel begins with ourselves here in Nazareth at St. John the Divine. This is the occasion of our annual parish meeting, and we're going to continue to talk about a mission of being a light for the city. And it's an old adage that I love to share every now and then, that the light that shines farthest shines brightest, closest to home. And so, as I say in the mirror, Lord, help me to be a Christian witness in the midst of a world where there are a lot of passions running hot, and understand that the best way I can affect that is to remember that you come home to my home to bring me release from all the places where I am impoverished and blind and oppressed. And may that be your prayer as well. And if that is continually our prayer, I am convinced we are only beginning to see the fruit of kingdom work spreading out beyond this place to the city of Houston, indeed perhaps even beyond. Amen.